Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Emily, what do you think the ROI is on a head of lettuce?
Are you talking about electric lettuce or the lettuce
I'm
you
talking
eat?
about plain old lettuce.
I really don't know. I eat a lot of lettuce, but I don't know what the ROI on it is, actually.
Well, neither did I. But apparently, Lactuca sativa crispa, which obviously you know as green lettuce, goes for €51 and can get you 12 to 38% returns on myfirstplant.eu.
Sounds interesting. And yet I am dubious around that because I'm pretty sure that vegetables have a razor thin margin. But hey, I don't really know at this point. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, 12 to 38%. What if I told you that you could e-grow by e-investing and earn up to 66%? Still skeptical?
My level of skepticism just went to an 11, if you will.
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? 66% returns. Well, I do want to talk about lettuce. I want to talk about both kinds of lettuce here because of this Forbes article today that talked about Juicy Fields, which is a similar platform to this My First Plant. And apparently there's a few of these in my limited research, which is a whole nother crazy thing, I think. But Forbes, and in fact, High Times covered this last week about this Juicy Fields, which is a cannabis investment platform that connects investors, or as they call them, e-growers, with cannabis plants. So you basically were to invest into a plant, into a specific plant, and the plants are of 4 different varieties, and they come at different price points, and they have different harvest schedules, which we'll dive into. And as you invest in these plants, you can expect up to 66% returns on your investment in 90 days. 90 days. It's the best deal I've heard all week. So Forbes and High Times covered this because apparently, this whole thing, unsurprisingly, is one giant Ponzi scheme. And a lot of people lost a lot of money, which was super sad. But yeah, let's talk about this because this was certainly cannabis related. And I want to talk about, how cannabis fits into this narrative here. But obviously, this is a bigger than cannabis. This is a broader problem with just kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes, promising things too good to be true, which, people just continue to fall for. But yeah, let's dive into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are the kinds of things we've just come out of one of the longest running bull cycles in the history of the world. And it's kind of like when the tide starts to go out, it exposes, whose swim trunks have fallen down. And this is when the Ponzi schemes get exposed. I think like the biggest Ponzi scheme of our time in recent years was Madoff. And that came out during the great financial crisis. And so now I think we're going to start seeing things like this happening. And we have been seeing it. This is not a cannabis specific issue. This is a broader issue around fast moving money, people believing things because they have seen stock charts that have just gone up and to the right for years without consequence. And when you look at the PE of these companies, it's really astronomical. So we have a long way to go for it to correct. But these kinds of things, when people are promised returns or guaranteed returns, all of these things are flags for investors to watch out for.
Yeah, and I think in this situation, it captured a few things like this kind of zeitgeist, and it's probably why it was so successful. And frankly, I had never heard of it, or if I had heard of it in passing, not really exposed to it. But I think this was a real problem in Europe. There's a lot in the article about the financial governing bodies in Europe, in places like Germany and Spain, coming out against Juicy Fields and warning people that were investing. But that zeitgeist really being, cannabis legalization in Europe, going beyond the US and just trying to capture that. And a lot of their marketing materials, they talk about this untapped opportunity in cannabis and how can you get into it. And with Germany, gearing up, on the precipice of some form of legalization, and other countries in Europe and, throughout the world talking about this and, exploring this, plenty of time to go yet, but it's in the media cycle, right? And so people hear about this and they think, okay, how can I get involved? And then you couple that with crypto. And they did take just fiat currency, but they also took a lot of crypto. And, as we've seen over the last 4, 6, 8 weeks, there have been a lot of crypto Ponzi schemes that are kind of getting unveiled, where these things were just propped up, these DeFi cryptos that were giving you insane returns, just unimaginable returns, not as high as 66%, I don't think, in most of crypto, but still, you're seeing that kind of happening at the same time. So you've got cannabis legalization, and then you got this crypto, exuberance that's happening. And here we are today where it's getting exposed. And I think the founders are long gone. I think people don't even really know who they are. These articles talk a lot about their nationality and where they come from. And it just doesn't sound above board at all. We could go into, one, let's start with just like, what the hell are these grow platforms and where on earth did this come from? It's like a Kickstarter type situation, but you're investing in a specific plant. And, the whole premise that they propose is that you can invest in one of 4 varieties and essentially their own strains. And it's so ridiculously set up. It's so obvious. If you know anything about cannabis, you do any research, you would understand that these are just made up. There's Juicy Flash, Juicy Mist, Juicy Kush, and Juicy Haze. And not just like the names, obviously strain names are always made up, right? Someone has to make up, they do a new cross, they make up a name. And I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about the way they set it up on their site, and which is now unavailable. If you go there, which, you can go and see, it's, I think, got some language because they're not paying their employees and they shut it down. But I was able to find kind of a white paper that they had written, and it talks about these 4 varieties. The first one, Juicy Flash, is only €50, right? So it's like the starter entry point strain, and it's harvested. Well, actually, it doesn't even say when it's harvested. And then you go down to Juicy Mist, which is a little more money, harvested 4 times a year. And then Juicy Kush is harvested 3 times a year. And then Juicy Haze is harvested 2 times a year, right? So they have this artificial harvest cycle as a way of like, this is more scarce. And obviously there's different grow conditions for different types of strains, but the way they're so perfectly fit into these tiers, and you're investing in one of these tiers, and then they were supposed to sell this to Canopy, to Aurora, they named in their paperwork, which have completely denied any relation. Not to mention, like, are they importing it from where are they growing this stuff? But this idea that they were going to be growing it and selling it, and then you're going to reap the rewards. It all just, I know we are close to the industry, and I know that we live and breathe this stuff, but I feel like you should be able to see through this. But unfortunately, people don't, right? And people get wrapped up into it. And I think it's a challenge of like all the marketing that went into it. I heard there's a lot of marketing spend that happened, and this company made a lot of money from people, and were able to double down on this. And sometimes when things look large and big, you think, okay, well, this must be safe. There must be something here, without really kind of thinking it through critically. But yeah, Juicy Flash, Juicy Mist, Juicy Kush, Juicy Haze. Just ridiculous.
They sound like different flavors of Axe body spray to me. I just feel like the whole thing is so gross. Yeah, to me, this is another example of how the slow rollout of legalization has a downside effect. This is how much people want to participate in the cannabis industry and invest into it. And I think it is pretty dreamy. Like the idea of being able to, I love investing in the cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and retail of cannabis. I think it is really tangible and interesting. And I think people desperately want to participate in this industry. And so, a few years ago before COVID, I spent some time in Europe. I went to Portugal. I went to the UK. I traveled around. And what my takeaway was that where Europe was in like 2019 going into 2020 was where we were in 2014. It's just a totally new, fresh market. And there's a lot of stars in people's eyes around participating in this industry and what it can look like. And I think that whenever there's that kind of hype or excitement around something, it creates a ripe environment for fraud, for people to kind of take advantage of that. And when I was reading some of the things in the various articles around this, I was reminded of some of the facts and the patterns that came up, for example, in the Theranos trials. And there's this thing around defrauding investors, which is, is attaching yourself to people or companies, as you pointed out, Aurora, Canopy, which of course was not at all legitimate, but just even listing it or giving the kind of the impression that you're more successful as a business than you are. Like these guys rolled into, I believe, a Spanish cannabis conference with Lamborghinis and kind of touting the successes of their business. And like many Ponzi schemes, I think that they did actually have some people who experienced high returns because they made sure to take care of those higher tier potential initial investors, at least initially, while they could, because that's the whole point of a Ponzi scheme in a way, is you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so those folks were able to say, yeah, I did experience returns. And so that's another thing that as investors, you have to be very careful about is you can't really have testimonials listed on your site, kind of like what the FDA said about, certain products. You can't really say the effects unless it's a proven clinically tested product. As an investor, you have to be very careful about the data points you list out in terms of your returns. You can't just cherry pick which returns you want to share. You also have to be really mindful about having testimonials at all. Like someone can say something nice about you, but you can't really put it on your website. It's a very difficult thing. And these regulations around all of this, while it's frustrating, as a person who works at an SEC registered firm and regulated firm, it's really frustrating to have to play within, those lines, but they're there to protect the investor community and especially people who are non-accredited. And so this is just also another interesting phenomenon that we're noting, as you raised, that is going on with crypto. There was that big one that exploded called OneCoin. And I think that was what did they call her? The crypto queen? Or anyway, that was one of the biggest defrauding of crypto investors, of course, up until now, where we see a lot of these exchanges are kind of blowing up. You had the guys who were running the Three Arrows Capital have been in hiding for weeks, dodging investors.
Sounds like this story a little bit.
It does. And, I was reminded too, because there's the prior CEO who was the CEO right up until 2022, and he's no longer in the firm. And he claimed there was infighting and that's why he's out. And then they did all this stuff. So he's very quick to blame the other people involved, which reminded me of the Three Arrows guys as they're blaming everyone but themselves on this. They've just started to kind of accept a little bit of culpability around it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of flags on this as somebody who spends a lot of time vetting and diligencing investments. They had, I think, corporate offices in Berlin. Some of the people associated with the top of the organization were from Russia, but they were like kind of not really easily understood where they actually are or are associated. And then they had a bank account in Cyprus. So there's, it just merits digging further into these things and trying to understand if there's even actually a market to support this concept as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are red flags all over. I mean, for the crypto, the thing with crypto is that it's all distributed and open and you can validate stuff. And apparently in the High Times article, they were saying that Juicy Field's executing thousands of seemingly meaningless moves to make it impossible to keep track of the funds. So taking that crypto that comes in and then moving it between a bunch of different wallets and mixing them with other amounts and sending them to exchanges to be withdrawn into fiat currency, right? And to buy those Lamborghinis. So, anybody could maybe run that down. Not that, people might be incentivized to, but, when things are too good to be true or seem too good to be true, it's always good to ask questions. And I think that, this industry should be a little better about it. Like right now, it's European Cannabis Week is happening, or it just happened out in Berlin, and they were a big sponsor of it, right? And so, as you take sponsorship money, and apparently people were already suspecting things about, this association, but no one was brave enough to ask because money's still green, right? So it's like, they could still pay. But I think that it's to the detriment of the industry we're all trying to build. And these get rich quick things that are built on top of it. And yeah, it's not related to cannabis. They use cannabis to generate attention, but obviously some of that money is going into cannabis because it's going into these types of events that need sponsorships, right, to promote legalization in its proper form. But I think when you start associating events that are legit with sponsors that are not legit, it just ends up bringing us down a little bit, right? So it's like the know your customer stuff, right? Even for events, I feel like we should be asking these questions when people are already kind of apparently saying, hey, this seems a little fishy. it's a little frustrating, right? That we've got this other black eye. I feel like we talk about black eyes constantly happening in the space. And I think, there's an opportunity here for the EU to say, look, there is a lot of interest in this space. And because of it, there's, this fraud that's happening. Just like with Minnesota and their edibles, right? They said, look, we've got all these edibles. We should just figure out a framework to legalize this because we've got this coming in. So in that sense, it might, accelerate things. But I think, frankly, it just slows things down. I think it just is another reason for people to point to, this is why we shouldn't legalize. Because look what happens to these poor investors that are, trying to invest. People take advantage of them. Who knows, right? But I just think it's more of a black eye for the space. And I know quite ridiculous for sure to think about, this whole structure, but super disappointing. What are you going to go for? Is it the Juicy Mist, the Juicy Kush? What's your go-to?
The Juicy Mist hits me in the back of the throat every time. I just smell a dance floor when I'm 21 years old when I hear that. And that's a fun place to go back to, but some of the sensory experiences there were not the best.
Well, should this strain ever pop up on the sales charts, we'll know at Headset, and we'll be sure to follow up.
We'll know, and we know it will be wearing a velour jumpsuit in probably bright pink.
Now you're really selling it.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.